My phone. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings of peace and blessings. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. My name is Imam Sohaib Sultan, and I serve as the Muslim chaplain at Princeton University. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to another round of Islam in Conversation, where we bring together scholars and thought leaders and activists and artists to be in conversation about Islam's contemporary role in the world. And today the topic of discussion is very relevant, and it is one that is on the minds and hearts of a lot of people, which is the US elections, and more particularly Muslims and the US elections. And so today we're going to think about how the US elections affect the dignified existence of Muslims in America, as well as around the world. And we have with us four really brilliant panelists who I will briefly introduce on a more personal level in just a moment. But before I introduce them, I want to thank all of the 35 people who have joined the Zoom so far. And hopefully over the course of the conversation, we'll have an even larger audience. And the way of our format is that we have an undergraduate student who is really involved in the Muslim Student Association, as well as Masjid, which is Muslim Advocates for Social Justice and Individual Dignity, who is going to ask the first round of kind of mega questions to help frame the conversation. And then we'll open it up to the audience, and we'll have all of you ask your questions. Maybe not all of you, because we don't have that much time, but as many of you as possible. I want to please remind you on a very logistical and technical level to keep your mics muted throughout, unless it is your turn to ask a quick question, just so that we don't have any background noise coming from anywhere else. I want to thank the Bob Center for co-hosting and co-sponsoring this conversation. And, I think that it's really important for us to come together as a community. And when I say community, I really mean that in very broad terms. A community of people who are thinking through the issues of our time together. And to help us do that today, we have four really brilliant scholars with us from the world of academia. And, there's a lot of different people who we could have invited to be part of this conversation who are just as valuable and just as worthy. But we really decided to go with the angle of, scholars who are studying the issue from an academic perspective to come help us think through the question of Muslims and the US election. So the first person that I want to introduce is Dr. Amaney Jamal. Dr. Amaney Jamal, if we can spotlight her for a moment so you can all see her. Sabrina will help us do that. There we go, Dr. Amaney Jamal. Dr. Amaney Jamal is a tenured professor of politics here at Princeton University. And she's been a really great friend and colleague in hosting these type of conversations with the Muslim Life program over the course of the many years that we've been together. And Dr. Jamal has written many books and articles on democracy in the Middle East, and has also written about the American Muslim community, and has served on a lot of different panels like this one, helping us think through the place of Muslims in the contemporary world. She does a lot of research that is not only qualitative, but also quantitative, which is really helpful to have statistics and data when we're thinking about the issues that we're thinking about. So thank you so much, Dr. Amaney Jamal, for being here and being part of this conversation. And the next person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Donna Auston. who holds a PhD from Rutgers University, if we can spotlight her for a moment. And she is in the field of anthropology, and she is a thought leader in our community who studies the intersection of race and religion. And she has written a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement in particular, and the place of Muslims within that movement. And she is, a very close friend of the Muslim Life program. And what I mean by that is that over the course of the many years, we've relied and drawn upon Dr. Donna Auston often to come and help us think through the issues of our time. So we're really grateful. I really encourage you all to follow her essays, her writings, her Twitter. I think you're most active on Twitter, perhaps. And so, that's a good place to follow Dr. Auston. The next person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik. And Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik is in the American Studies Department at Rutgers University. And she is actually, for this academic year, at Princeton University as a fellow. And so we're really excited to have her even more intimately involved in the programming of the university. And Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik has also written a lot about the intersection between religion and race. And her book on the history of African-American women, Muslim women, has been one that has been really helpful in the development of our understanding of the Muslim community as a whole. And Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik is also a very close friend of the Muslim Life program. We've drawn on her wisdom a lot over the last few years, and we're really honored and happy to have you here with us today. And last but not least is Dr. Nura Sedige, who is a lecturer in the newly named School of Public and International Affairs, which was more famously known in the past as the Woodrow Wilson School. And she has been here for the last 2 years. This is her second year at the university. She holds a PhD from Duke. And she brings a very unique perspective on the questions of race and religion. I think especially having spent a lot of time with, the younger generation of Muslims, and seeing how they look at politics and public policy today. So we're really honored to have you as well. These are all very, very brief introductions. You can read their full introductions over the emails and the Facebook posts that we have put up. And also, I really encourage you all to, follow them on their social media and in their academic works. They're really contributing greatly to the discourse. In an age when people have forgotten how to engage in intellectual and sophisticated discourse, these four scholars, are showing us another way. And so I hope that all of you follow them very closely. So with that, I would like to introduce Abdelhamid Arbab, who is a sophomore here at Princeton University. And as I mentioned earlier, he's really involved in the Muslim Student Association, as well as an organization called Muslim Advocates for Social Justice and Individual Dignity. And he is in our community, one of many leaders who is thinking very carefully about the place of Muslims in the public square. And so he is going to be asking the first set of 4 questions, what I call the mega questions that we could think of, to get our conversation started. And the way that it works is that he's going to direct each question to a particular scholar who we have with us, but all the scholars are invited to respond to that question. And then after a little while of doing this, we'll open it up to the now 56 people that we have with us on Zoom, and we'll take it from there. So once again, thank you all for joining us so much. We're really excited to have you and excited to have a really thought-provoking evening together. And with that, I'll leave it to Abdelhamid to kick us off, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Imam Sohaib. And as always, I'm very grateful to have all the panelists here and for everyone joining us. But the first question is for Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik. And I'll probably be repeating the second half of the question twice because it's a bit wordy. But for this question, we want to zoom out and look at Western liberal democracy as an institution. We find Teddy Roosevelt himself saying that democracy needs no more complete vindication for its existence than the fact that it has kept for the white race the best portions of the world's surface. This comment was made in the 19th century, and of course, much has changed, but some argue that liberal democratic institutions of law and politics are ongoing settler colonial structures. If this is the foundation of American democracy, an imperial and colonizing force, then to what extent should Muslims put faith in democratic processes, including voting? Yeah, so the question essentially is, if American democracy is this imperial and colonizing force, then how much should we trust in the voting process? And I'll leave it to you, Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik.
Well, thanks for that really easy softball question to kick us off. I wanted to first say assalamu alaikum to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Inshallah, we can have a spirited yet reasonable and thought-provoking discussion around these very contentious issues. As Imam Sohaib said to the panelists before we signed on tonight, our event, which of course is the most important event of the night, is going to be followed by another, I don't know if you call it a media or a political event this evening. You probably know what it is. Turn on the TV after this is done and you'll see. But we live in a moment in which every conversation seems pitched at a 10 or above. And so so much of this is part of the issue of why this moment, in addition to quarantine, in addition to COVID, in addition to all that comes with it, just feels so exhausting. And so this question of whether Muslims should have faith in US liberal democracy, I think kind of builds upon the larger mood of, at times, hopelessness in this moment. Like, what can we turn to in this moment in which there is so much grief, so much suffering, so much division, and seemingly so much polarization in this country. So I wanted to set the tone to say that I know all of us are feeling a particular way. And as Muslims, we are taught that we are not to despair. So that is something also to consider as we think about these questions. I just was able to look over the questions before we began, and the first thing that came to my mind was the larger structure of settler colonialism as it occurs in the United States. So a well-known phrase by the scholar Patrick Wolf, one of the most well-known scholars of settler colonialism, is that settler colonialism, the idea that the settlers come and they stay, as opposed to the example of, say, the British in India, where the colonists came and subsequently left, right? They did not without leaving their marks on that society, of course, like deep marks. But in settler colonial societies, the colonists stay, they never leave. And so Patrick Wolf, an Australian scholar, says settler coloniality is a structure, not an event. And it is a structure that we are still living with to this day. And so many of our conversations right now around Black Lives Matter, police abolition, police reform, are we thinking about abolishing? Are we thinking about reforming? Is what to do with the existing structure at hand. And so I think that's what the question is really about. What do we do with structures that we've seen over and over produce inequality, produce disenfranchisement for huge groups of people? And so a way in which I've been thinking about this is by looking at historically revolutionary movements in this country and thinking about how Muslims can actually engage in political, revolutionary types of spirited actions. And one particularly insightful reading or intellectual that I've come to again and again is Ali Shariati, who's commonly known as one of the architects and leading intellectuals of the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s. And one thing Shariati says is about a particular way that Muslims, guided by Islamic principles, can follow the Prophet's example, peace and blessings be upon him, in thinking about revolution, is that, and I'll actually read it, I found the quote. He says, the Prophet preserves the form, the container of a custom which has deep roots in society, one which people have gotten used to from generation to generation, and one which is practiced in a natural manner, but he changes the contained, the contents, spirit, direction, and practical application of this custom in a revolutionary, decisive, and immediate manner. And so if anybody would like to see that quote at some point, I'm happy to share it. But what he's saying there is that we live in this society as it is. And to think about suddenly undoing everything that we have that is familiar. We can change the names of things, we can change the meaning, we can change the work that we do within them. But in a process like voting, right? In a process like liberal democracy, this is a way in which American society has coalesced as a nation. And many Muslims have come to this country voluntarily, some not, right? But in order to change the meaning of voting, the meaning of liberal democracy, I believe is a gradual reshifting and remaking of the meanings of what it is. And so I'm giving a rather academic answer to a question that perhaps begs a more urgent, practical answer at this moment. But I absolutely think Muslims should be invested in this process, not have faith, be invested in understanding how this process works, in understanding how they can be agents of change in imbuing it with new meaning, and being part of the necessary actions, organizations, challenges that bring about more justice in these structures that already exist in the US. Right. So that is really how I think about it. We're not going to do away with voting. I heard a wonderful podcast about the Electoral College today that really, I mean, we should have, the Electoral College has long been shown by many scholars to be one that is based in the giving more power to slaveholding states in the South. But we still use this process. So if we understand that as Muslims and we stand against racial injustice and anti-Blackness, we should really be working to reform the Electoral College. Right, or abolish the Electoral College. And so things like that, to understand that this is the system that exists. And until we can figure out a way to gradually transform it into something new, a new entity, we need to work with every ounce of our power to engage it and to challenge it on the side of justice.
If no other panelist has anything to add, I'll move on to the second question, which is for Dr. Donna Auston. So 4 years ago, we held a very similar panel. We didn't know who was going to be president at that time, but many were saying that we were presented with a false choice of lesser of two evilism. And now we face a very similar choice, but with more strenuous circumstances like the pandemic. Many of our fears have come true. We see rising levels of white supremacist violence and tangible manifestations of Trump's hostile rhetoric on Islam, like the Muslim ban. Is the lesser of two evilism still at place, or should refusing to cast a ballot in favor of Biden be seen as a valid form of protest and harnessing of political power? Taking a step back, should we be wary of rapid, quote, revolution and favor politics of incrementalism and consensus building? I know that was a lot, so I'm just going to repeat the end of that. So basically the question is, should casting this protest ballot be seen as a valid form of harnessing political power? And also, should we consider, or should we be cautious of this rapid, quote, revolution attitude towards politics and favor more incrementalism and consensus building? And if you need me to like repeat any of that, please let me know.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Again, just want to reiterate that it's wonderful to be in conversation with you all again. It's always a pleasure to participate here. And of course, I remember that panel very well because I was on that one. So we, at least I think three-fourths of us that were here, that are here tonight, were also at that panel 4 years ago, trying to figure out, you know, what was going to happen in 3 weeks or so. And so what I will say briefly is that, and I think in a lot of ways, my perspective on this builds on what Sylvia was talking about in terms of, you know, recognizing that what you have is a structural reality, a political reality that you have to deal with. It is not going to vanish tomorrow as much as, you know, we think we might like that, right? So we have to kind of figure out how to enact a practice of harm reduction. And this is a very, you know, particularly, and I think, you know, this is always a strategy that is a very important principle to think about when thinking about political engagement across the spectrum, right? Harm reduction is always a principle that guides any decision that I would make or advise others to make about how we need to engage. And this is certainly something that is a central pillar in usul al-fiqh, or, you know, when we think about how the principles of Islamic law dictate rulings, harm reduction is absolutely a very important consideration. And so I think we need to think about, you know, I know, and I understand the frustrations behind, you know, okay, here we are again, making a choice, you know, between two less than ideal options again. And it seems like we're always in that same position. And I think the answer to that is in part to start thinking about political engagement as a constant practice, right? A lot of times these conversations come up, you know, in the high fever pitch of election season. And then people make decisions about whether or not I vote in this election without actually looking at the longer term strategies, right? If you are voting, if you're not voting, what are you planning to do November 5th? Or, I mean, I don't know. I don't even know what the cutoff date is this year, right? Because we don't necessarily know when we're going to have a definitive answer to who's the president, right? But in any case, the strategies that we think about engaging have to go beyond the election cycle, right? Political engagement is a constant practice. What are we advocating for at our local community level, at our school board level, at our city council level, at our state level, like whatever, all of these things, and outside of electoral politics, right? Including, of course, however we choose to engage, you know, in terms of casting a vote. But casting a vote has always been one strategy among many in terms of political organizing and advocacy. And I think if we don't understand that, we're always going to feel like we're behind the 8 ball, right? And, you know, always feel like we're reacting to a set of circumstances that, you know, that seem overwhelming. And the choices that we have to make are crisis decisions that they're always sort of crisis moment decisions, because we're not necessarily keeping up sustained pressure to make the system more just in the ways that Dr. Chan-Malik talked about. And so I think for me, we do have to have a conversation at some point, a very real conversation about the ways that the two-party system continues to fail people who are the most marginal, right? And so, however, to begin that conversation a month or 2 months even before a very critical and probably the most critical election, it's certainly the most critical election that's come about in my lifetime, right? And to not extend it beyond the, you know, whatever the results are in a few weeks is a fatal failing, right? And so I think whatever our strategies are, they have to be longer term, and we have to think about this as a you know, how do we engage these issues, inclusive of voting or direct participation in electoral politics, but also how do we think about supporting our communities when all the chips fall, right? And so for me, and honestly, I think this notion of revolution, right? Particularly in political discourse, in a lot of activist circles, is often framed as a very rapid, do or die moment, sort of and often has a very nihilistic sort of bent to it. But actually revolution is, as I understand it, is really about a longer term process of building things, right? Building alternatives to what it is that we have that we know is not working. And actually, so that's sustained political engagement, right? And again, for me, politics is way beyond just voting, right? That sustained political advocacy, activism, organizing, whatever is the process of revolution, right? There is no such thing as an instant fix. There is no such thing as, snap your fingers and you have this, something completely different. I mean, even in this particular contest, where I happen to think that while neither of these choices, when I dream of, what I would like to see at the top of, the presidential ticket, neither of these choices like really make me jump up and down, right? At all. However, what I do understand is that the possibility to engage in a more productive way and a decidedly less harmful way, right? With more chance of the opportunity to at least continue, right, to move around the types of issues that actually will make life or death differences in people's everyday lives, right, is much more likely to happen under one of those choices than the other, right? And so for me, yeah, but I do also, before I close this round of comments, I will also say that I think those of us who are interested in figuring out ways that we can maximize political impact from marginalized communities really need to figure out a way beyond shaming to engage those folks who have really opted out of the process, to just because they don't see how participating in the electoral circus. I think we were tossing that term about before we went on air, because they really fail to see the ways in which this participating or doing the things that we're supposed to do, being a good citizen and voting, right, has actually made a difference in their lives. And I think we have to figure out how it is that we take seriously the reasons, the ways that people have been systematically disenfranchised from the vote, right? Because that's actually a very important aspect of this, but also alienated from investment in the process of voting and understanding what it is that they are able to accomplish through participation in those channels, what they're not able to accomplish in participating through those channels. And I think part of that is not framing voting as the be all and end all of political engagement, right? And understanding this is one thing. I mean, if you listen to, some of the legendary activists that we look to, people like Kwame Ture, I mean, it was just like, he talked about this, voting is just one thing. And this is somebody who, spent a lot of his career as an activist organizing voter registration drives, but the understanding was that's not revolution, right? It's a tool that we use in order to accomplish a specific set of things, and is useful to the extent that it belongs to a total package of other types of organizing, advocacy, and political engagement. And so that would be my my general answer to that question.
Would anyone like to add anything from the panelists? Okay, so I'll ask the third question, and this one's for Dr. Nura Sedige. It is increasingly the case that Muslims of younger generations are aligning with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and or progressive movements not tied directly to any party. On the other hand, some Muslim voices have cautioned against Muslim Americans focusing on allyship at the expense of orthodox stances on certain social and cultural issues. How should Muslim Americans who yearn for social and political reform navigate this tension? Is it enough to simply suppress one's positions on those hot button social issues and focus on areas of common ground? So just to repeat the question, how should Muslim Americans, and specifically young Muslim Americans who yearn for this radical change, navigate this tension between being told by maybe more traditional Muslim voices that they shouldn't focus on allyship at the expense of orthodox stances in faith?
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. I just want to begin by thank you all for having me. I feel like I'm making a basketball reference before I begin, but I feel like I got invited to play basketball with Kobe, LeBron, and Anthony Davis. And that's, the esteem that I hold for the scholars on this panel. Their books are tattered that I've read. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you and with everyone else here. And young Muslims are really important voice for us to listen to. And one of the things I think we need to think about is how diverse Muslims in the United States are. 60%, I think, generally of Muslims do not regularly attend Friday prayer. So you have a spectrum of Muslim voices, experiences, types of practice. And I think what's happening right now is you are seeing an emerge sort of voices coming from pockets of the community that may not have felt like they had a space to speak up at a mosque. There's different types of spaces that now exist where we see Muslim voices emerge. And one of the common experiences that Muslims across types of practice, different cultural and racial backgrounds sort of emerging is simply experiences of discrimination. We belong to a group that is highly stigmatized. And in a post 9/11 era, experiences of discrimination have really been a rallying round for folks to think about. We want equity, we want to be treated like others, and a really, for Black Muslims, for certain communities, they've known, right, that the United States is has been built on systemic racism. For other Muslims, that's sort of become this reality that they're sort of now grappling with, right? And so for young Muslims, they're growing up, having a more keen awareness of the history of the United States, and just the fact that they're sort of, that this history is not new and it's something they've inherited. And so this notion of equity, of equality, is something that's sort of become a central focus point for young Muslims, right? And so there's this common saying you hear folks discuss in organizing spaces, like our liberation is bound together, right? And so there is this tension, I think, that does exist. We have to consider about the experiences young Muslims are having in the era they grew up in versus perhaps the generation above, and aspirations for an equity that they're seeing doesn't exist. And much the same way they were sort of raised to think it does. So there are conversations that needs to be had about what that looks like and how we build common ground. I think we also have to think about the fact that it's not just diversity of racial backgrounds or cultural backgrounds, but diversity of practice, of religious practice. And for me, part of my work has been doing one-on-one interviews with Muslims in different parts of the United States. And I'll spend time with folks in really like socially neutral spaces, and people are young Muslims who barely know how to pray are defensive and protective of being Muslim, right? So how do we build a space where we can have a conversation with those folks and folks who grew up in the mosque and had, Thursday night youth halaqas? And you see a kind of connection between Muslims from those practices in a meaningful way that I think we can take advantage of and build a collective community understanding. And for what Dr. Chan-Malik and Dr. Auston were saying about voting and types of political participation, we need to build community to build accountability. Folks need to know when we say go vote, when we say engage in protest, we need to let elected officials know we exist, we're a voice, and you are responsible to answering to us when it comes to the legislation that you are passing. And we are focusing right now on national politics, but I think one of the things we need to really think about are state level politics, local politics. You know, we think about Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar didn't just emerge and run for Congress. She's from Minnesota. She's engaged in a local community and sort of rose into a position from there. You have a lot of incredible first generation African women running for state legislator in places like Tennessee and winning local offices. And that matters. So building spaces for us to get engaged in the political process on a local level matters. And us just sort of coming to an understanding of we need to build unity and group solidarity to let folks know that you're accountable to us. We pay our taxes, and we need to do more than that, as we need to show them that we're going to show up and ask you what you're doing on our behalf, because we were already doing, we're expected to do things at a bare minimum anyways. So I think that's an important voice. And I think that right now, what's really powerful is seeing different types of Muslims kind of coming forward and wanting to work together in a way that I think may not have been possible before.
Okay, and for our last question, this is for Dr. Amaney Jamal. So this question is asking that Muslims in the United States are known to have a political consciousness grounded in global solidarity. That is one thing that has unified us in US politics. How has this consciousness manifested itself in the quote, Muslim vote at different levels of government? And to add to that, more generally, what does this election mean for the future of US foreign policy? So just to repeat that, two-part question. The first part is focusing on how foreign policy has manifested itself in the quote unquote Muslim vote at different levels of government, but then also what does this election mean for the future of US foreign policy in general?
Thank you so much, Abdelhamid, for that question. And thank you, colleagues, Doctors Donna, Sylvia, Nura. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you on this panel. And Imam Sohaib, thank you for always inviting me back. I hope it means that I'm not making too many mistakes when I'm on these forums. So I really am privileged to be here and to be speaking to everyone tonight. So if I may, Abdelhamid, I sort of sat quietly. I just maybe had like one or two things to input on the other questions you asked my colleagues. On the question of whether the structures of liberal democracy are oppressive in a way that sort of basically precludes participation for the enhancement of equality and human rights and belonging, I think that's a fundamental question. And I think for especially for the younger generation who's in this conversation, yes, I think the simple answer is yes. A lot of the structures here have been used to oppress minorities, but I also believe, as somebody who teaches about the institutions of governance, that when you have these institutions set up to represent the interests of populations through the election, it also means that although the institutions will remain intact, the way they perform and what they come to embody and whom they represent has to do also with who is participating and who is at the table and who is making demands and asking and not only asking for recognition, but demanding recognition. So don't forget that democracy has never been about a set of institutions that are just hanging there in a capital or in a city. Democracy is about the people working underneath those structures. So I'm not trying to whitewash the history. I'm very, very cognizant about that history. People who know me know that I've written about it. I talk about it. But for the young generation who's basically sort of saying, well, Sanders is not on, let me just be very explicit. Sanders is not on the ticket. I don't feel like I want to vote for Biden. He's an establishment candidate. Think twice. think about the other alternative. You know, there is a strategy in elections, which you should be voting for the worst. If you're in this world that all these politicians are evil, there's still an evil, and there's an evil that is worse. And if you think that you need to think about your communities, and you need to think about the communities that you care about, their ability to mobilize, their ability to organize, their ability to talk about Islam, Muslims, faith, Sharia, things that are linked to the faith, whether it's debates about Sharia or how we even conceptualize that. You need to think about which administration or president will allow for these conversations to happen in the public sphere. So that's my little get out the vote petition. Sorry, I don't know, Sohaib, if this was supposed to be apolitical and only academic, but I just felt strongly to say that yes, there is a bad side to the institutions. Yes, sometimes we ponder about whether or not we really have a choice that we want, but I think everybody has an obligation to vote and to exercise that right, because this is a right that if we were in many other parts of the world, we wouldn't have to begin with. I know I sound really old school, so I apologize. I really look forward to your questions on this, and I do have responses. So that's sort of my first set of questions. Okay, so Abdelhamid asked me about what the Muslim vote means, and especially what it means for foreign policy. So I sort of want to be a little bit academic. So I would say maybe if I got this question from Abdelhamid maybe 20, 30 years ago, I would say the core issues concerning the Muslim community in the United States are issues linked to foreign policy, like Palestine, like ongoing wars, civil wars, maybe alliances with countries that oppress their own populations in the Middle East. I mean, there's a whole history of those type of relationships. So those were some of the key and core issues on the mindsets of the Muslim community in the United States. Kashmir, for example, among the South Asian population, especially when we think about the Muslim immigrant community in the US. The indigenous Muslim American community, which is primarily African American, they have always been consistent in their voices about civil and political liberties and the necessity to protect those liberties. With Muslims now being in the US, we're beginning to see the second generation and the third generation coming to age and being very active in the political system. The demands are, I think, the shift in the Muslim American community, coupled with the shift in the political climate, right? You have 9/11, then you get now like the war in Iraq, which was devastating on many, many, many different layers, not only for the Middle East, but for the Muslim community in the US. And then you get Donald Trump. I mean, fast forward, you get George Bush, you get all the post 9/11 civil liberty infringements on Muslim communities. You get Obama, who was slightly better. You know, some people thought he was Muslim, some people thought he was not. But nevertheless, you know, there was a discourse that was more hospitable towards Muslims during the Obama years, although the record in the Middle East and in Pakistan and in Yemen with the drone attacks and things of that sort, that's a different debate. Abdelhamid, if we're thinking about foreign policy, then you get Trump, right, in office. And so for Trump, everything Muslim is bad. Whether you're Muslim American, whether you're Muslim in the Middle East, whether, you know, what to do with Islam in America. So he goes ahead and institutes the Muslim ban. So I think the primary issue now for Muslims when they go out to vote in this election, regardless of whether you like Biden or Trump, the fact that there has been a Muslim ban in place that is targeting a religious minority group explicitly and unapologetically, which was not even overturned by the Supreme Court as racist, tells you that you need to get out to vote, because your children should not grow up, your children and your siblings and your future children should not grow up in a country where they can explicitly, like, this is not the 1800s. We're in the 21st century where your community can be explicitly targeted for no other reason than being born to a faith community. This is outrageous. And so to think that this is normal or this is okay, it's not. And Biden, you know, whether you guys like Biden or not, the first thing he said, he has engaged the Muslim community. He has been meeting with representatives of the Muslim community. The first thing he said he's going to do is overturn the Muslim ban, which is just a symbolic gesture. I don't really think people are dying to come to this country in droves anyways right now. It is a pandemic. But nevertheless, symbolically, this is something that has to be overturned and cannot stand. And Islamophobia should not be part of a campaign to acquire votes, right? Islamophobia and hatred of Muslims should not be used as rhetoric to mobilize the vote on the behalf of the Trump campaign. It's despicable. And so keep your eyes on this. This is why it is important for everyone to turn out to vote. Even if you don't have your first choice or your second choice, you still have a choice and you should exercise that vote. Sorry if I sound a little bit patronizing. That's completely not my intention. I just don't want people to sort of think like they're inactive agents and such is life and we don't have a voice and we don't have influence. We do, especially, sorry, Abdelhamid, I have to say this, Muslim American vote. Everybody will say, oh, well, 1% of the population, maybe 2% of the population, if we're counting them right. The Muslim American vote is extraordinarily important. Why? Because if you look at some of these most contested states that are going to determine the election, whether it's Wisconsin, whether it is Michigan, whether it is Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, those communities have upwards of 5%, maybe 10% Muslim voters in their states. That is huge. If you think that Trump won, I think Michigan by less than 50,000 votes, that's within the 1% margin. Muslim Americans can swing this vote in some of these key battleground states. So don't undermine the influence of Muslim American voters. It's really, really important. So I just wanted to make sure I said that. Now, what does it mean for the Muslim vote? I think the primary symbolic sort of unified stance here is that if Biden wins, we will have a president in office that is, and I know this is pathetic, right? I know that this is pathetic to even say, is not going to hate on us every other day in his speech, in his rhetoric, and basically flame anti-Muslim and Islamophobic tendencies throughout the 4 years of office. So that's the first thing. That's the first accomplishment, what the Muslim vote means. In terms of what else Biden will do, at least for Muslims, I mean, they're going to be better represented in his administration. He's already met with them. He's already met with several of the Muslim political leaders in this country. He will definitely, be mindful of their civil and political liberties in this country. And as far as foreign policy, to the extent that this is an issue, and here I just want to say, if you look at the public opinion of Muslim Americans, Muslim American public opinion is divided on foreign policy issues that are what we consider Muslim. So for example, again, 20 years ago, the issue of Palestine was far more salient. Today, it's not so much. Having said that, Biden has promised that he is still committed to the idea of a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. Donald Trump has completely gone away with the idea of a Palestinian state. Biden has promised to protect the interest of Muslim minorities worldwide. When you think about what's happening in the Rohingya community or the Uyghurs in China, Biden has explicitly said that he's going to look after the interest of Muslim minorities. When you think about the Iran nuclear deal, if we go down this path of the hostility against Iran with hawks like Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump in power, I have to worry about a preemptive attack on Iran in a second Trump administration. That would be devastating for the region. You need to understand that we still have not recovered from the if I may, the sheer blunder and irresponsible invasion of Iraq and taking down that government. Everything that's happened after that in the Middle East, whether the Arab Spring, and then the entrenchment of authoritarianism, and then the creation of ISIS, which led then to the huge the Syrian revolution and the refugee crisis into Europe. You could trace all of those incidents back to that Iraqi invasion in 2003. It's almost 20 years later. Billions and trillions of dollars have been spent to try to create a stable government in Iraq that could have been spent here in the US to support our public schools, to make sure we have protective equipment in case a pandemic happens, to make sure that we have tests and we can trace this stuff like the rest of the world. I mean, it's pathetic when countries that don't even have 5% of our resources have dealt with the pandemic better than we have in the United States, but we're too busy, like, you know, invading countries and tearing them down. So you have to worry about what an attack on Iran will mean for stability in the Middle East and for the Muslim community here. All academic studies have shown anytime there is a military confrontation between the US with an Islamic country or in the Muslim world or in the Middle East, Islamophobia in this country escalates immediately. We are always the primary victims when something is going wrong in the Middle East or the Muslim world. So even if our public opinion in the second generation and the third generation doesn't care a lot about the issues in the Muslim world, and I'm not saying this, in terms of like, you know, you should care or you shouldn't, because we have a lot of things to care about in this country too. So I get it. But even if you don't care or you do care, when something happens bad there, guess what? They're here throwing garbage and trash at our mosques, with our school children in those mosques. Our institutions are held hostage and under attack, and levels of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment just increase here. So this is why we need to think about who will be the leader who will have better relations with the Muslim American community here and Muslims abroad, because in the end, we are all part of the same ecosystem. Sorry, I went on and on, but thank you so much for the opportunity for me to sort of, it's, you know, we're in COVID, we've been in front of Zoom, so this is actually very good for me too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amaney Jamal. Before we open up to the audience, I think it's best if we leave it up to any of the panelists if they have any additional thoughts with anything said or any of the questions asked. That would be awesome. So go on ahead.
I had one quick thing to Dr. Jamal's point on the margin of votes. I had a research assistant run the analysis, and really, like, we looked at the key swing states last election, and we looked at first and second generation immigrants. So I think if we took Dr. Jamal's population and did the same thing, we really literally can swing these states to be blue and get rid of Trump. It's quite like numerically quite possible as long as we show up. And so I just want to reiterate that point, because I think we lose sight of how much power we have.
I wanted to just add in there, I think, Nura, you had some wonderful remarks about the diversity of religious engagement in the Muslim community in terms of how many Muslims, attend the masjid or are practicing, or et cetera, in terms of their political ideologies. I would just want to stress that every single time we say a term like Muslims in US elections, we are talking about the most diverse religious group in this country. Right? We are talking about a group that not only has so many different racial and ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, class backgrounds, regional, national backgrounds, right? But we are talking about a group that has, because of generational issues, very different conceptions of the nation state, of America. What does America mean? What America means to African-American Muslims and their relationship to it is going to be very different from a recently arrived Syrian American, right? First generation, or a refugee community, or a Somali Muslim. So when we think about political engagement, it's such a nuanced conversation when we talk about Muslims, because we are talking about such different relationships with the nation states, as members of the diaspora, as immigrants, as fourth generation African-American Muslims. And so it's why it's a really important conversation to have, to think about how we engage political institutions. It's also a very difficult conversation to have. So I just wanted to put that out there, that we really need to account for that, because just as much as foreign policy is such an important issue for Muslims, so is racial justice right now, right? I mean, this moment in this country is absolutely tied to the history of Islam in this country. So is immigration, so is religious freedom. All of these issues are deeply, deeply, deeply meaningful to Muslim communities. So that's part of the diversity as well.
I want to thank Abdelhamid for asking really great questions and for all of his work in putting together these great questions over the course of the last few weeks. And a team with him behind the scenes who were engaged in that process. And I want to thank our scholars for really bringing their full scholarship to the table and really answering these questions in a very thought-provoking way. So we have at least half an hour for questions and engagement with the virtual audience that we have over Zoom. And so we want to open it up now. And I'm going to ask Abdelhamid and the assistant to the Muslim Life program, Sabrina, to really help me with this, because I know there's a lot of people and it's sometimes hard to see who's asking questions. And so probably what we'll do is we'll take one question from someone who's willing to ask their question live, and then we'll look at the chat to see if anyone has placed a succinct question in the chat that we can read out. But let's go back and forth between the voices of people and the questions of people in the chat. So if there's anyone who has a question and you're willing to actually state your question in voice, you know, if you can just use that option to raise your hand virtually, the virtual hand, and then we can get to you and you can unmute yourself for a minute to ask your question. So Sabrina and Abdelhamid, if you can help me with that. I know some questions are already coming into the chat, but I can't tell if anyone's raised their hand yet to ask a question. Well, while people are warming up and you know, thinking about their questions, let's go ahead and go to the questions that are in the chat. And so there's one question that is from Alif, and another question that's from Rebecca. Abdelhamid, did you want to read the questions?
No, I was going to say that Fawaz has his hand raised.
Oh, he does. Okay, great. Well, why don't we start with you, Fawaz, and then we'll go to the chat questions.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Firstly, I just wanted to say what an honor it is to get a chance to hear from all of you. And I think a lot of the energy that many of you brought while talking, I don't think it's misplaced at all. In fact, Professor Jamal, to your point, it feels very refreshing to hear like passionate sounds, even if it's just, you know, sounds in like a little frame on the picture. So thank you all for that. I wanted to ask, I know Professor Auston or Dr. Auston mentioned this. I'm not sure who's a professor and who's not, apologies. But I think like on the topic of being consistently engaged, even outside of, you know, just like the election season. And I can definitely say for myself, 4 years ago and even now, this is like, you know, the kind of energy and excitement conversation that leads up to the election makes a lot of people that would not feel engaged kind of get engaged. How can, you know, I mean, I'm speaking from a student perspective. On many days, a lot of students, you know, barely find time to, you know, go speak to their families or, you know, do these kinds of things. So finding time in there for like a lot of Muslims that are living very, very busy lives, like what are ways in kind of, I guess, across the spectrum that Muslims can engage meaningfully within their communities in a way that is sustainable and it is practical. Because it just seems sometimes it seems like such a tall order to like get like, you know, the very common things like phone banking or going to like, I don't know, like rallies or conferences and things like that. So maybe if you all had ideas on how Muslims just living their everyday lives could do that. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So my general advice to people is to find something small and manageable and something that actually makes you passionate, right? Something that is actually exciting for you, and get involved there. There's so many things that need to be done like every day. So you might be a person, I don't know, maybe you got a few extra bucks, right? Even if you can't be on the protest lines, right? You can give money to bail funds, right? For people who do get arrested protesting and have to be out there, right? You can, or to legal funds and that sort of thing. There's all sorts of ways that you can find to play a supporting role using the resources and talents and interests that you have, right? And chances are there are already organizations out there doing the work in whatever area it is that you're interested in. Find them, plug them in, and figure out what it is that they need, right? And find ways to tap into that. Okay, so maybe I can't phone bank, right? But maybe I have another kind of influence with a senator that golfs with my dad or something, right? Who knows, right? There's all sorts of ways that people might be able to use their talents, resources. I think the limits are only limits to our imagination, right? So in other words, but I think it also, again, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think requires an expansion of thinking about what political engagement looks like, right? It doesn't just look like spending hours phone banking, right? There's all sorts of ways. I mean, people need editors, people need, and it doesn't have to be that you devote, 30 hours a week to something, right? It might be 1 or 2 hours a week. But I think finding ways, even hosting a political discussion, I mean, maybe post-COVID, right? Or whatever, but actually having a few people over for dinner, right? And having, meaningful discussions about what it means, what's at stake? What are the issues that keep us up at night, right? What is it that we need to do about that, right? All of these things, so I mean, just, an informal political education circle, right, is something that people can do in order, to raise their own awareness, to figure, and insights come from that. So I think there's all sorts of ways, right, that people might find that are sustainable. And I think the principle guiding for me is like, because people get I think one of the things that happens is that there's an enthusiasm. And so in those moments of enthusiasm, we're like, oh yeah, I can conquer the world. I'm gonna I'm gonna phone bank, and I'm gonna be at the march, and I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna do that. And you can do that for about 5 minutes, right? But if you find something that okay, maybe I devote an hour a week to this, or a once a month gathering, or or whatever it is, or I make a regular donation to people who are engaged in the work, or I take a certain amount of time to educate myself and my friends on this issue, or like I said, whatever. Like the limits are only in your imagination, right? So figure out where, how, why. I mean, whether it's education policy, whether it's energy and climate change, whether it's whether it's police brutality, whether it's racial justice, whether it's economic, whether it's economic concerns, right? Whatever it is that is, are the things that actually drive you and keep you going, are the places where you're going to, where I think you can find ways to plug yourself in and actually do so in ways that allow you to do this. Because this is a marathon. It is not a sprint. Right. And this is like, and I just, and so the conditioning process for those two types of races is very different. Right. So I think, I think there's no shortage of work. There's no shortage of ways to be involved. And also don't think that whatever it is that so I think a lot of people are kept out of the process by thinking that, well, maybe what I have to offer isn't significant. And so they just don't, right? If I can't be that person who's doing this 40 hours a week, then I just, then I'm not important. But the greatest movements toward for freedom and greater justice, if you think about the civil rights movement, for example, everybody looks at the civil rights movement and they think about Martin Luther King, right? But there's a whole lot of people that made Martin Luther King possible. And you don't know their names, you've never seen them, you've never heard of them, but they were doing important everyday tasks in a wide variety of domains, right? That made his I have a dream speech possible, right? For example, if we think about like the pinnacle or the, one of the most memorable moments from that era, right? So all of these things, and they were all necessary, every last one of them, right? So think about, you know best what you have to offer, what you're capable of, what your limitations are, what your interests are, right? Use that information to help you figure out the best ways to get involved. And nothing is too small, right? So even amongst, and I think also one of the other things that I think a lot of us do when we're thinking about this question is we assume that, well, somebody else is going to do it. So it's not actually vital if I don't. And I think that's one of the worst mistakes that we can make. The fact of the matter is that these issues were here yesterday. Like my mother dealt with these issues. My grandmother dealt with these issues. My children will inherit these issues. And it's my responsibility, right? Because lives depend upon all of us actually contributing in whatever ways we can to bring about greater measures of justice, equality, safety, and respect for life, right? And this, and implementing a paradigm where the sanctity of life, right, is the prevailing principle by which the world operates. That's going to exist in greater or lesser extent in our lifetimes. But this is, I think for me as a Muslim, that's what gets me up in the morning. I want to create a world where the sanctity of life is the prevailing principle that guides how things are structured. And so I have to do something. And that's my responsibility. It's our responsibility, but it's mine. And so I have to figure out ways that I can contribute to enacting that in some way, shape, or fashion, right? So use your imagination. You will come up with plenty of ways that you can help this process along.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that. Let's move to some of the questions in the chat, some really great questions that are coming in, and then we'll go back to people who are raising their hands. And so the first question that came into the chat that I saw was, sorry, I think I'm scrolling on this thing. There was a question about what does candidate Biden's approach to US-Turkey relations mean for Muslims around the world? So this is a particular question about US relations with Turkey and Biden's approach to that relationship for Muslims around the world. Maybe Dr. Amaney Jamal, if you could give your insights on this particular question.
So that's a really good question. So I'll be honest, I haven't followed up exactly on the Turkish platform, but my sense is that if you look at the constellation of alliances in the region right now, Erdogan has a strong relationship with Qatar. For a while there, it's still ongoing, the rift between Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So there's this more sort of like, this alliance that's against Qatar and Turkey, but the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood being front and center, whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood is a movement that should be banned or a movement that should continue to participate in politics across the region. As you know, and to the point that Sylvia mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamic movement in the Middle East, but it too is extremely diverse. So the Muslim Brotherhood in one country is not necessarily the same brand in another. People support the Muslim Brotherhood for a variety of reasons. So it's not a monolithic movement in any sense of the word. Nevertheless, the Trump administration has, along with Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt's Sisi regime, more or less designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And if you sort of watch the politics, a lot of those members of the movement ended up in Qatar and or Turkey in the last 5 or 6 years, if five, maybe over the last decade. So that's one of the issues. I think Biden is not going to have this issue be a polarizing issue. I think Erdogan's pivot eastward has a lot to do with a lot of, the Trump rhetoric and the Trump interactions with the Muslim world. I think Biden will try to be far more inclusive, and just thinking about Biden's less isolationist stance to international partners, allies. Turkey's an important member in terms of U.S. relationship and in terms of a lot of the international organizations. So I think there's going to be rebuilding a lot of the relationships that we've had with previous allies, not only with Turkey, but also in Europe as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jamal, for that. And there's another question that came in saying that we are not one issue people, even as African Americans, of course. I care about healthcare, climate change, gender rights. Can someone speak about that? I think it goes to what Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik was saying earlier about, the diversity of our community and diversity even within each community, within, within the spectrum. And so even like the same could be said about, the South Asian or the, or the Arab Muslim community, that they're not a monolith there either. There's so much diversity of concern and thoughts. And so if one of you want to say more about that, that would be great. But let me just read a couple of other questions that I thought were interesting. There's one question in which there is what are the most important aspects in Republican policy that are important to Muslims. So far, I think we've talked a lot about the relationship between Muslims and the Democratic Party. But are there any issues that Republicans raise that are important to the Muslim community? And I will say that a question that came in that's also, I think, somewhat similar is, how should Muslims think about conservative Supreme Court judges who publicly embrace their religious commitments? Is that an opening for us to dialogue on and build coalitions with non-secularists on the role of religion in the public sphere? So I think that's an interesting question too. So I know I threw a few out there. I hope some of you can answer those.
If you don't, I feel like I don't want to take up too much space, but I really wanted to respond to this in particular. I've been thinking so much about the role of the Christian evangelical right in this election, because one of my new projects is looking at the intersections of race, religion, and politics, and really thinking about Muslim alignments in this political spectrum. And so, as many of you probably know, in the 2012 election, not 2012, in the George Bush election, the George W. Bush, at that time, in the 90s, the vast majority of Muslims in this country actually voted Republican. Not the vast, but I think it was the majority of Muslims were voting on the Republican ticket. This changed vastly after the events of 9/11. And so now primarily Muslims will vote along a Democratic line, though again, incredible diversity in the US Muslim community. And so this has really kind of troubled me in terms of how certain Muslims I see talking about kind of secular politics and the role of religion in the public sphere. And, Muslims should support a religious conservative for the Supreme Court, because this really aligns with our values as people of faith. So I want to just put this out there, that religion and religious freedom, as so many wonderful scholars such as Tisa Wegner and others, Tisa Wegner at Yale and others, have said, is that religious freedom was conceived within a framework in which religion truly equaled Christian Protestantism. Sorry, having a hard time speaking tonight. And even the alliance with conservative Catholics that has happened in this moment now is really been one that has been born out of political expediency. This happened in the late 20th century, in which the Southern Baptists and the religious right in this country saw that it was politically expedient to join with conservative Catholics to oppose abortion within politics, because in the past, Catholics were also persona non grata for the Protestants in this country, right? So we have to understand as Muslims, when there are these conversations about religious freedom and the freedom of religion and a conservative Supreme Court justice, this is a fallacy, I believe, to think that this is going to be good for the Muslim community in this country. As Dr. Donna Auston, my wonderful interlocutor and friend, she and I had a conversation that was published. You know, Islam is a non-white, non-Christian religion that is inextricably linked to brown and black bodies in this country. And so when we are talking about freedom of religion, we are not included, you know, wholly in that definition. So I personally, to speak bluntly, do not think a conservative, religious conservative justice on the Supreme Court does anything for Muslim communities. And while the Republican Party might have at some point, in terms of values and morality, reflected some of the concerns of the Muslim community, I think the current GOP as it stands no longer reflects that. And in itself, you see the dissension in its own ranks. So I just wanted to put that out there in terms of thinking what about religion in the public sphere actually means in this country.
So I wanted to jump in here just to add a little bit to that, because I was going to actually also mention the chapter that Sylvia and I co-authored together, because I think one of the things that we were trying to do in that chapter was to think about what it means to articulate a Muslim political paradigm, philosophy, platform, whatever you want to call it, or a set of ethics in guiding questions and pertinent issues. And I think this actually touches on a lot of the questions that were asked in that last round, right? Because I think one of the things that I've been doing a lot of thinking about, and I've actually, frankly, been quite frustrated about watching some of the developments in Muslim political discourse in the United States, is the tendency to go down the lizard hole of religious of white evangelical Christian politics, right? And in terms of the priorities, right? Because one of the things that's happened with the rise of the religious right and the growth over the decades of white evangelical perspectives, particularly within the Republican Party, has been a way that religion and religiosity and morality and moral questions have been severely restricted to the regulation of sexual behavior. Right. And so what does it mean to be a religious voter? Oh, well, you believe in a heteronormative version of marriage, and traditional, not having sex outside of that bond, that sort of thing. And that's kind of all we call that family values. We call that pro-life. But in reality, I mean, if you think about the totality of the political perspectives and positions that people who would be described as pro-life or from this religious background who proclaim to uphold the sanctity of the family really actually only care about who's sleeping with whom. They don't actually support policies, for example, that would expand food stamps, or that would provide healthcare to everyone, or that would actually provide the types of economic and social, the attacks on public schooling and the disinvestment in public schooling. All of these things are actually things, material things that help families to sustain themselves. And if you are concerned with the stability of the family, it has to go beyond who the adults are that make up that family household, right? So whether it's a man and a woman, and I think this is one of the things that when we get to the Muslim community, I think that's one of the things that's sort of guiding guiding a lot of Muslims into the arms of people who I think in many ways stand for the exact opposite set of values that Muslims are supposed to uphold: caring for the vulnerable, making sure that people, I mean, we literally have wealth redistribution as one of our 5 pillars. And so we're talking about starving people because they don't, because this is as a religious value. Like, I don't, like, for me, I can't reconcile those things. I can't call myself a Muslim and allow my neighbor to go to bed hungry. And I mean neighbor in a very broad sense, right? So for me, I think the range of issues that are considered quote unquote Muslim issues or of concern to Muslim voters, right? And I think this speaks to the question about the diversity of African American, because for me, I've always said this, like, I'm actually not, regardless of what the normative Islamic prescriptions may be on sexual behavior between 2 consenting adults that aren't me, right? It is that it is a moral imperative for me to make sure that people have food security, healthcare, shelter, et cetera, that the earth is not polluted so that, to the point where we can't, we don't have a good water supply, to make sure that, that people have access to good education. I think these are religious values, right? And I think when we do ourselves a disservice as engaged citizens, but also as Muslims, when we are so neurotic, and I'm using that word deliberately, about the sexual behaviors, and primarily the sexual behavior of women, right? Because there's a really lopsided way in which there's an anxiety about, how Muslim women behave sexually somehow reflects where we are. Like, that's the barometer of the nation. That's the barometer of the ummah. Right? Do they cover? Do they not cover? Do they, like, whatever. And I think, I think we have to be really careful about following people down the proverbial lizard's hole. Because I think we actually distort I think we distort prophetic teachings profoundly when we do that. And I think it's also important to point out that, racism is not an Islamic value. And that is absolutely has to be non-negotiable. And if you are a Muslim, and this is probably going to ruffle some feathers, but if you can live with racism because you don't like queer people or whatever that is, or that makes you uncomfortable, I think that presents a bit of a, that's a problem for me. I'm so and I can't really say it any more plainly than that. I think that we really have to be more imaginative about what Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim issues are, about what morality means, and about, and again, and I think it's connected to my again, to my opening remarks about what it means to be politically engaged. And I feel like a lot of these positions, to speak to Sylvia's point about there being a certain amount of expediency involved in these calculations, I think we need to be really careful about, jumping on a sinking ship, because we think that it provides us with some measure of social safety. I think doing the right thing really needs to be a more expansive type of program.
Wow, great answers. Really, really thoughtful. Thank you so much. And let's take a question from the mic, so to speak. So Nabil, you had your hand up. Just before Nabil asks this question, for those of you who have been with the Muslim Life program for a few years, you might remember that 4 years ago when we had almost the exact same panel, it was Nabil who was playing the role of Abdelhamid and asking the questions as a student, and now he's a graduate student at Princeton. So welcome, Nabil, and please ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice. Abdelhamid, you're doing a great job. Assalamu alaikum. And nice to see my former advisor, Professor Jamal, here. Really nice to see you. Hope everyone is well. So today the Senate Judiciary Committee approved the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. And one concern regarding this shift in the Supreme Court, in addition to implications for healthcare, gun control, is the scope of executive power. The question of executive authority in immigration, for example, was the central question in the Muslim ban case, Trump v. Hawaii. And as we have seen, Congress's delegation of authority to the executive branch has continued to harm Muslims in particular. One example we all know well is the Patriot Act. And one thing that really appealed to Muslims about a candidate like Bernie Sanders is this commitment to not expanding the surveillance state and kind of reining in national security platforms. And as we know, the surveillance state is growing faster than ever thanks to the tools offered by big tech. Biden's approach to these issues is less clear. Like, sure, he would repeal the Muslim ban, but would he relinquish the White House's grip and the Department of Homeland Security's grip on shaping immigration policy? So my question is, in the event of a Biden victory, how should Muslims organize and advocate for Congress's reclaiming of its authority and mandate to legislate, especially in the realms of national security and immigration? How can we push Biden to reverse this trend of granting power to the executive over like several decades?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, Dr. Nura, we haven't heard from you in a while, so why don't you kick us off, and then if any others want to add their voices.
I mean, it's a tough one because I think it's important. Again, I think it goes to accountability and how we're building accountability within how we engage if there is a potential Biden administration, right? And so I think this is exactly where, when folks say, we have incredible law, so we have like Muslim advocates, we have the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, we have these legal instruments which I think we not only need to pay attention to, we need to fund, we need to be employed by, we need to engage as volunteers. I couldn't vote when I was 21. So I volunteered with ALDEF to monitor election polls and get engaged because I was a political asylee and it takes like 20 years, even though I came when I was 5. There are ways to engage with these legal groups to build accountability on the ground. And I think that we need to really point our attention to that and also make the process of the Senate Judiciary Committee and these legal processes more understandable to people, to Muslim voters on average. One of the most profound things I saw coming out this past election cycle was a former classmate of mine translated propositions in the state of California in Farsi with her mother for other voters. There are ways to sort of engage and make these things clear so that we can build accountability and show people why this matters. So I think that's one step in it. This is a really, I don't have a clear answer in the sense that I would want to hear from the other panelists, because just you bringing up the increase of the surveillance state really like puts this like punch in my gut feeling. It's alarming how much it has changed things. There were people in the 1970s that were on the list of like, that were Black Panther organizers that the government couldn't touch. As soon as the Patriot Act happened, you know, it opened up the surveillance state to go after not only Muslims, but other people that were, that the government wanted to sort of have more access to and prosecute. So the repercussions of the increase of the surveillance state are really pernicious. They not only harm Muslims, we rather face, but they harm Muslim adjacent communities. And I think we really need to think about that and how we build allyship with communities that are harmed in tandem with Muslims.
Thank you, Nura. Can I just chime in here?
Yeah, please do.
So really quickly, thank you, Nura. That was excellent. Just really quickly, Nabil, good to see you too, and I hope you're thriving in these circumstances. I sort of want to link your question to the previous conversation, and Dr. Donna and Dr. Sylvia were very eloquent on this point. Again, to highlight the diversity of the community, if you go to ISNA, which is the Islamic Society for North America Conference, just go from panel to panel and see the amount of diversity, and not only the diversity of the makeup of the community, but the diversity of topics the community cares about. So, so when you look at the social conservative values, whether they have to do with same-sex marriage or abortion versus, on the one hand, or the role of redistributive policies in government, the Muslim community is diverse, but it very much is far more for big government than it is for the socially conservative policies. Nevertheless, the social conservative policies do track support in the Muslim community. Having said that, the one issue that galvanizes Muslims these days because of circumstances, when asked, have you ever experienced discrimination? The Muslim American community is the one community almost similar to the African American community that will say that it has experienced discrimination. About 3 in 4 Muslims have experienced discrimination in this country. When the mainstream non-Muslim population is asked which minority group is discriminated the most, they will say Muslim. 82% of non-Muslim Americans say Muslim Americans are discriminated against. So this issue of discrimination and being targeted and the levels of Islamophobia in this country are what's uniting now, quote unquote, the Muslim vote. And it's masking a lot of diversity underneath that. But nevertheless, I think that's why you're seeing the pendulum swing towards the Democratic Party. Now, for some Muslims who really care, who are one issue voters, who care about social issues or the redistributive issue, that might determine who they will vote for. But nevertheless, I think by and large, the Muslim American community, stands united against this discrimination and Islamophobia emanating from the mainstream. On the question of the Supreme Court justice, I worry about this Supreme Court further galvanizing executive powers in the administration's hands. Now, this is all assuming that Trump stays in power. So that's why it's even more important to vote, because if Biden is in power, I think there's going to be a different sort of philosophy around how much authority should be concentrated in executive hands. But to your issue, will Biden be better on the security state or the surveillance state? We should also remember something else, Nabil. Even in 2016, when you moderated this panel, the Democratic Party is not the same Democratic Party it was in 2016. There is a very strong and forceful progressive element that has two of the most leading Muslim congresswomen in the country basically pushing the Democratic Party and Congress and government to look at how minority groups across this country are criminalized by the surveillance state, how our rights across minority groups, how the racialized communities are being treated by these quote unquote benevolent security structures. So what role can you play, Nabil, and you and your friends and colleagues? Make sure you're following your congressmen, and women, and make sure that you are lobbying them on these issues. These issues matter. They get at the heart of equality and trying to eliminate racism and discrimination in this country.
These are some really great answers. Thank you all so much. We're coming to that time when people are thinking of more questions and we're running out of time. So we're going to just take another few minutes to conclude our evening together. I wish we could go on even longer, but I think giving people a break is important as well, and we'll continue to have these conversations over time. So I'm going to look at some unique questions that are coming in that haven't maybe been given enough attention this evening. One is that there was a question that, can the panel reflect on the existing Muslim American organizations in the political engagement space and share their honest evaluations of them, both things that are done well and areas of improvement? Jazakallah khair, great conversation. So that's one question that I think would be interesting for us to look at. There's some comments that came in, but let's maybe. I thought there was one other question. There was another question on the issue of taxes, that there are Muslim Americans who are considering voting Republican because they're concerned about their taxes going up. This goes to the issue that the Muslim American community has diverse concerns. There's a lot of small business owners in the American Muslim community that are oftentimes more allied in terms of economic or tax policies with the Republicans than with Democrats. So we haven't so far talked about the economic impact or the economic aspect of the U.S. elections on the Muslim community. So maybe that would be an interesting question for us to think about as well. And then we'll take one last question from Zarina, who's raised her hand after this round, and then we'll conclude for the evening.
So I'm sorry, the question we're addressing is the question about about taxes and economic policy, or?
Yeah, so the first question was about American Muslim organizations, how they've engaged with the political, and an honest evaluation of what they're doing well as things that could be done better.
Okay, so I'll just really quickly, I'll say that I think one of the things that has been encouraging to me over the years, I think particularly post 9/11 onward, is that I think the emergence of various types of Muslim groups across the spectrum have been more explicitly vocal about participating and articulating public opinions on important political issues of the day. And that's the range of them: foreign policy, security, but also issues of racial justice, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that the conversation is, I became Muslim in 1990, and I know. And so I've seen quite a bit of movement, I think, on the ways that, I think a lot of what was happening before, not totally, but I think a lot of what was happening when I was first Muslim, at least in the circles that I traveled in, is that a lot of the political conversations happened in Muslim circles, but it wasn't necessarily translating to advocacy, organizing, policy work, that sort of thing in the public sphere in the way that it has become in recent years. I think there's been a tremendous growth of Muslims across the spectrum of political ideologies actually becoming active players and trying to shape the discourse and conversation on issues that are important, maybe specifically to Muslim communities, but also on issues that affect other people in various ways. So I think that's encouraging. But of course, you probably knew there was a but coming. But I think one of the things that it is also important to think about is the ways that within that spectrum, right? I think there's been a lot of, to my mind, troubling. There's been at least, especially in the years since the last time we had this panel, I think there's been a very vocal, and how that shakes out numerically amongst the Muslim population, but I think from a certain quarter of religious leadership, prominent nationally known religious organizations, teachers, and institutions have been steadily articulating a very right-wing, conservative, harm, and to my mind, harmful endorsement of Trump and other sorts of right-wing figures, right, coming from Muslim religious leadership. Folks like Ben Shapiro, some of these other characters that really, people who really do actively promote harmful, racist, sexist, and economically harmful positions, also harmful positions on issues like climate change, militarism. I'm sorry, my cat decided that he wanted to talk. I don't know if you all can hear him or not. Yeah. We'll talk to you later. But I think that, and I think because of the influence that these particular figures have, I guess it remains to be seen what kind of effect that will have in the long run. But that's one of the trends that actually alarms me right now, because I think it's, it's certainly not, as somebody who was attracted to Islam because of the potential for social justice that it offered. I was somebody who became exposed to Islam primarily through hip hop music and the ways that conscious rap in the late 80s and the early 90s really, articulated, imperatives for social, racial, political justice through a Muslim-centered lens. And for me to see, right, later people saying, well, it's it's Islamic to sort of endorse people who have actively promoted policies that are extremely harmful to marginalized people, extremely harmful to the environment, extremely harmful to fair and reasonable and equitable distribution of material resources across the population, is really that's a hard pill to swallow, and it's very difficult to watch. I do think, and I think these are conversations that I think we really do need to have internally as a Muslim community about, who it is that we are, and that's taking into account all of that diversity, but really thinking about what it means to be a Muslim political subject, given, all of these various directions that the discourse is happening in. So those are some of my reflections on the first question.
Yeah, others on this question of evaluating American Muslim organizations who are thinking about the economic impact of the U.S. elections on American communities.
Actually, I went to a conference hosted by New American Leaders. It's an initiative that encourages first and second generation immigrants to run for office. I saw more Muslim elected officials there than I think I've seen at ISNA. And I'm specifically thinking of Safia Khalid, who is in City Council in Minnesota, in Maine, Nadi Mohammed in Minnesota, Zulfat Suara in Nashville, Safia Wazir in New Hampshire. So there are people, to me, there's a question of who are the people who say they speak for Muslims, and then who are the Muslims on the ground engaging populations and doing the work? Sometimes they converge and sometimes they don't. These women that I mentioned are all first and second generation immigrant women, most of them Black Muslim women that are immigrants, doing the work in their communities. But they're not the ones that you see on social media engaged in these fights. They're the ones that have their sleeves rolled up and they're engaged in cross-coalition building. And so to me, they give me hope. They give me inspiration about what it looks like to build effectively on the ground. And I think there are models there of ways to build that I want us to look to, because to what Dr. Auston said, it is really alarming to see the same people that were leading in the 90s, leading in the 2000s and the 2020s, and not enough accountability to be like, maybe it's time that you engage and think about if the thoughts you have now are really helping or harming the communities that you spoke for, right? And I think there's two sides of this, but my hopeful side kind of thinks of these women and the work they're doing. And then part of me is really surprised that we don't uplift them and amplify their voices when we think of elected politics. So yeah, I want us to think about those individuals as well.
I just had a quick, I know we're getting to the end of time. There's still some questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but just 1 minute. I wanted to actually build off Nabil's last question, then connect to the question about organizations. Nabil, you asked, how do we as a Muslim community hold a potential, I mean, we don't know, but I think this would apply to a potential Trump administration as well. How do we hold them to account? Well, one of the things that has been endemic of political discourse is this language of reformism versus real change. So for example, when you're talking about police reform, as opposed to abolishing the police, scholars have talked about the fact that when you reform institutions, they ultimately wind up shoring up and giving more power to those institutions. CVE is a way of reforming the war on terror so that we Muslims are co-opted into our own surveillance. Right? So when you reform things, you ultimately maintain the structures of the oppressive power that it was put in their place to begin with. So the larger issue, Right? And so Biden has shown himself to be someone who is a very reformist candidate. So how do we address this? Well, we look at the larger issues at hand. And one of the larger issues that Professor Jamal just talked about is a shared understanding that Muslims are under attack in some way, that there is a shared interpolation that we have. Carcerality, right, which joins immigration and detention, surveillance, policing, prisons, all of these things. Thinking about the carceral state and how that can be something that connects the diversity of Muslims with other communities, I think is one thing that we as a Muslim community need to educate ourselves about politically so that we can build coalitions. And talking about organizations, one organization that has emerged out of this moment that I just wanted to highlight is a group called Believers Bailout, which is an Islamic organization that raises bail funds. And so in this organization, which is rooted in Islamic principles, you see the possibility of building coalitions within a Muslim institution with other groups who are working for prison abolition, to think about restructuring police departments, all these types of things. We are building coalitions. Muslims need a political education in this country, in particular, non-Black Muslims. Right. And so the way that we can create those models of political education and create those channels for it is by working with other groups. And at this point, many of our major organizations are quite insular insofar as they don't build those types of organizations. So looking forward, I think that's really something Muslims should be looking to understanding how to build coalitions around the issues that matter to us on a broad scale.
These are all really great thoughts. So to conclude our evening, I'm going to ask Sister Zarina Shakir to the last question of the evening. I think you'll want to use your mic, Zarina, so go ahead.
Okay, so I'm unmuting. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you? Okay, so assalamu alaikum to everyone. I've listened to this program and so many programs at this point, and I'm going to definitely try and be brief. And so what I want to say around the religious piece is, how many of you know what the composition of the Supreme Court is? Well, rather than people trying to figure it out, if this woman comes on, there will be 6 Catholics and 2 Jewish for the moment, but nothing against Catholics or Jews. But what's interesting is in America, considering groups like the KKK, the White Citizens Council, and all of those groups that were so against not just Black people or people of color, they were against Catholics and Jews. What is the composition of the Supreme Court right now? Catholics and Jews, not one Protestant, definitely not one Muslim. That's what my comment that I wanted to make. But my question was really about the Electoral College and the fact that there are a lot of people standing in these long lines. We've got these absentee ballots. All of what we're doing to get through this year's election, we still may not get there because of the Electoral College. I would like for at least one of the guest panelists to try and say something about the Electoral College. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Great question. Any takers to conclude our evening?
I think I mentioned, I just spoke, but I just really quickly I mentioned that actually at the beginning of the evening. I absolutely think we should abolish the Electoral College. We are the only Western nation in the world that does our elections in this manner, that does not hold the popular vote higher. Even the founding fathers, many of them believe that we should hold our elections by popular vote, and the Electoral College was a default compromise that we used at that time to try to get the Southern slaveholding states to sign on to the Constitution, right? So to ratify the amendment, to ratify the Constitution. So it is absolutely an antiquated model for elections that should no longer be relevant for our our population today. So I'll just say that, and I think it does not serve Muslims well in the states they live in. Muslims are a highly urban community. Many live in big cities, many live in blue states, and it absolutely does not do Muslims any benefit to maintain the Electoral College as the way we do our elections.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank our panelists so much for spending the evening with us, for your reflections, for your thoughts, for your ongoing scholarship. If you look to the chat group, Sabrina put the handle for each of our scholars' Twitter panel. So if you can follow them on Twitter and continue to follow what they have to say, not just about the elections, but well beyond the elections, political organizing, and so much more that our community is doing and struggling with. I'd like to thank you all for coming. At our peak, we had almost 85 or so people. So that was a really great turnout and really good attendance. And thank you for staying on and for listening and for engaging. A lot of good questions that came through and a lot of really interesting comments as well. I want to remind you that this is the month of Rabiul Awwal, which is the month in which we celebrate the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So on Thursday, October 29th, which is next week, and then the following Thursday, which is November 5th, we have two events that are going to mark this celebration of the Prophet's birth. And on October 29th, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is going to be offering some remarks and some reflections. And on November 5th, we have a really wonderful scholar by the name of Sheikh Muhammad Minawi, who is going to be offering a lecture on the Muhammadan heart, the spiritual life and attributes of the Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. So I hope you all can join us for that and spread the word among your communities for that. So look forward to further engagement. For now, have a good evening and peace and blessings to you and to your families. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Assalamu alaikum. Take good care.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Yes. Looks good. Imam Sahib, my mom wanted to say hi. Thank you.